As social distancing becomes our new norm, many of us are finding online solutions to work, to contact loved ones, to get what we need. But not everyone has access to the internet or even a computer. Our next guest is Dana Floberg, a policy manager at Free Press. We'll ask her about the digital divide and the public policy solutions to help equalize internet access. Dana, thanks for joining us today.
Of course, yeah. Thank you for having me.
So talk about the digital divide. What is it and how is it showing up in our country today?
Yeah, the digital divide is, in reality, it's a lot of different divides and a lot of different inequities that kind of layer on top of each other. It's the disparity between those who have broadband access in their homes and those who don't have any connection to the internet. It's the difference between those who have laptops and those who only have a smartphone. It's the difference between those who can connect at libraries and those who have to rely only on mobile internet subscriptions. So there's a lot of different layers of it. And what we've seen is that it tracks pretty closely with a lot of other inequities and inequalities in our society. One of the biggest predictors of who has the internet at home and who doesn't is income. If you are lower income, you are disproportionately less likely to have internet than higher income folks. Free Press has also done a lot of research that shows that there's also a racial element of the digital divide, where people of color are less likely to have broadband at home than their white counterparts. Some of this is because of systemic income inequality that already exists in the US. But even when we've controlled for other demographic factors, things like income and education, we still see people of color often lagging behind their white counterparts in terms of broadband adoption.
So why do so talk about the I guess the corporate aspect of this, the fact that big companies like AT&T and Comcast both control the internet pipelines and charge us to gain access to them. Wouldn't a good solution to the problems they're in? Well, talk about the problems that are related to corporate control of something that maybe should be a public good. And then talk about how we can maybe incentivize them to build an affordable internet.
Yeah, some of the major problems with trying to bridge the digital divide and make sure that everyone has equitable access to the internet is that right now our main providers of the internet are not actually interested in serving everybody. They are much more interested in cornering a market of wealthier folks, of whiter communities. And there's not a lot of competition. Even when we talk about how capitalism is supposed to work, it's not working here. Most folks, if you're lucky, you have one, maybe two internet providers to choose from, assuming you can even afford to pay. We're seeing increasingly when these companies don't compete, prices just keep rising. Right now you have, before this crisis, Charter or Spectrum, depending on where you are in the country.
The worst company ever.
and their marketing.
I used to complain about Time Warner. Oh, now we have Spectrum. Oh my God.
Right. And they use often in their marketing materials, they're proud of the fact that their slowest tier of service is very fast, but it's also $70 a month. You can't get service cheaper than $70 a month, which is a way that company is saying, we're not interested in serving people who can't afford to pay $70 a month. Now, in this crisis, some people are changing that and they're offering more low-income services, but that's something that is just that's the place that we were in when the pandemic hit.
Talk about the tangible effects to people's lives due to the digital divide and how those have changed now that the pandemic is upon us.
Yeah, not being able to connect to the internet reliably, not being able to do it at home, not being able to connect to fast internet can have all sorts of consequences that for those of us who have reliable access can be invisible a lot of times. Jessica Rosenworcel, commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission, has talked a lot about the homework gap, where students who don't have reliable access to the internet can't do their homework because most homework assignments these days require an internet connection to do research. That's even worse now that we have students who are actually relying on the internet just to connect to the classroom. Forget about homework, just doing classwork now requires an internet connection. The same is true for telework. The same is true for connecting with healthcare providers. We've done, even before this pandemic, we've seen cases where connecting to folks via the internet is a lifeline. It's how so many of us apply for social services and support. It's how we keep in touch with folks. It's how we bank. It's how we do so many really important things that for a long time, many people in this country have been unable to connect to. Mm. That has been heightened and sort of drawn into the light with this crisis now that shelter-in-place orders have meant that for everybody, everything is moving online. And if you could have maybe made it work, a lot of folks who don't have reliable home internet would go to libraries to get connected or do other things, go to public places. You hear a lot of stories about children doing their homework at McDonald's because that's where they can get an internet connection. Now, even those workarounds aren't available. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is not great. And not to mention that so many doctors' offices are encouraging people to, if you don't have COVID, but you have a problem, to go use a teledoc service, use a face-to-face internet service. So how do people without the internet go to the doctor during this time? I'm sure you could call, but it's not quite the same.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times too, there's folks who have difficulties with both. We're seeing, I'm sure many folks have seen, if you're going online and doing banking, going online and doing a lot of things, they sort of warn you. They're like, our call times are really long right now because everybody who can is trying to call us instead of coming in. And I think what we've seen some anecdotal evidence of, yeah, if you can't connect with your doctor online, if you can't connect with your doctor on the phone, you're going to go into the office. And that's something that is a public health risk for you personally, for the other folks who are in that office. That's something that we've seen a lot of low-income communities of color who have been reliant on these lower tier, lower price services that have limited minutes or limited data, who run out of their data, run out of their minutes during this crisis, and have no choice but to go physically into the pharmacy, into the doctor, and expose themselves potentially to catching or spreading the virus.
Amy Goodman reported today that there's an overlap of another issue, which is the fact that people who are undocumented are unwilling, to go to doctors' offices and hospitals, and are dying at an enormous rate because of their fear of ICE raids and that kind of thing. And without access, if they could use the phone or the internet, they wouldn't have to go in. So that seems like there's a lot of overlapping problems here.
Yeah, I think, and this tracks with, this country and many other countries' history with racism and structural inequities, where they just compound. Already you have undocumented folks in other communities of color who are less likely to have this access. They're also more likely to be impacted by job losses right now, to be impacted in all these ways, less likely to be able to access services, less likely to feel comfortable accessing services when there is this risk of their documentation. And all of these things just keep compounding. And it's no wonder really that then we are starting to see some of the data showing how this virus is disproportionately impacting some of our most vulnerable communities because we've stacked the deck as a society so far against them.
Can you talk about the policy solutions for the digital divide and where we are in terms of potentially making the internet a public utility?
So Free Press's first priority right now during this crisis is to try and get and keep as many people in this country online as possible. We see the first step to that is trying to figure out how to make broadband universally affordable especially for folks who are losing income, losing jobs right now, who may have been able to afford broadband but can't now, as well as those who've never been able to afford this service and are finding that the stakes for that lack of access are even higher during the crisis. We have, as Free Press Action, we have called on Congress to put more money into programs that offer low-income service. One of the main programs for this is the FCC's Lifeline program, which typically helps support basic communication services for low-income people. We've asked them to put more money into that, as well as to expand it to really make it something that can promote broadband connectivity, that can offer $50 monthly subsidies to those who need it to get connected, even when these prices are so out of reach for so many of us.
This is, I find it very disturbing because, you know, a lot of children who rely upon the public school system for access to computers and all kinds of information, they cannot obviously access that at this point in time. And now there's talk about how public education is not ever going to recover to the way it was. And in the post-pandemic world, we're going to have to think of new ways to educate people in smaller groups or something like that. And it just seems like it's really, the whole thing is working to marginalize people who don't have.
Yeah, I think that this is a huge part of why we're focusing so much on the response to this moment and the response to this crisis, because there's, as with so many things, there's sort of two ways we can go. And one of them where we stick to the old systems that we've had with regards to broadband access and maintaining this digital divide for those who are lower income, for those who are marginalized. Or we can let this moment teach us what we have been needing to learn for a long time about digital inequities and say we can't allow this to happen. If we do need to change education in the short term, medium term, long term, then we also need to change the way we think about broadband access. We need to make sure that everyone, that it is universally affordable, universally available.
What about free?
Free is a nice number. It's a number I'm personally
universally
a fan
affordable.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's something that we are definitely calling, especially in this moment, for a lot of companies to think about doing, is to offer free services to folks who can't afford anything. There is a reality that for some folks, no price.
Services for, why can't we offer no price?
At this point, a lot of that is sort of a legal question as far as who owns these networks. I mean,
the government could step in and say, well, we're going to have to nationalize the internet so that everyone can get on there, as they could possibly step in and do with the oil industry, or they could,
right.
If someone was of the mindset that the public good came above corporate profit, nationalizing broadband seems like it would
they could. They certainly could. I think I am probably not alone, though, in being skeptical of, for example, this particular government having nationalized control of the internet. And so that's kind of where some of our concerns are, is that on the one hand, yes, and we've seen a lot of times on a smaller scale, public alternatives to these private ISPs, municipal broadband networks, other community broadband networks had been really successful. And one of the other things that we've been pushing for at Free Press is to get rid of the laws that stop communities and municipalities from building their own public networks, their own community-owned networks. But I think, a lot of times the internet is a utility, and it is something that everybody needs access to. And this crisis shows that more clearly than it's ever been shown before.
What would your concerns be if, say, an unfriendly administration were to nationalize the internet?
I think there's a lot of concerns, and I'm not an expert in all of them. But I think that we can see in other countries where the government is in a position to shut down the internet. We also know that even in this country, under this administration, we have lost our rules protecting the open internet, protecting net neutrality, which makes it okay for companies to block or slow certain content as long as they don't promise not to do it.
You're seeing that all over YouTube right now, right, and other places. I mean, yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So I think that a government having that power as well is also a concern. We want the internet to be universally affordable. We also want everyone to be able to get where they need to go to and not have to deal with a federal government as a gatekeeper or any of these private corporate ISPs as a gatekeeper.
We're speaking with Dana Floberg. She is the policy manager at Free Press. Dana, final thoughts for folks who are keeping an eye on this issue?
I think the biggest thing right now is that we really need to push our institutions, our federal government, to respond to this moment, to get people connected. That has to be the first priority. That's going to be what we need to weather this crisis immediately, to make sure that people are staying healthy and staying safe. It's also what we're going to need in the longer tail of this crisis. With the economic recession, people are going to need to be able to connect from their homes, from anywhere that they need to be.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. You can find Dana at, it's freepress.org, is that right?
Freepress.net.
Net. I knew it was a different one. Didn't Free Press used to put the National Conference for Media Reform together?
Yes, that was a big project for many years for Free Press.
Can we do it again? I always thought it was wonderful. I've been looking and waiting.
We're always talking about it. I think right now that's probably not on the immediate agenda, but it's something we're always thinking about.
It's always been wonderful. So thank you so much. And I look forward to having you back on the program. I appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Bye-bye.